Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion, which is research and practice implementing a flood sensor network for Resilience NYC. I'm John Matinos. I'm a project manager at the C2 Smart Center. We're a US DOT designated Tier 1 University Transportation Center tasked with leveraging recent advances in big data and technology to solve today's most pressing urban mobility challenges. I have a bunch of questions prepared for our researchers today. But I want to invite you to ask your own all throughout, and I'll periodically draw on these. You can do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll occasionally just insert those into the conversation where the energy is. So I don't want to talk too much in the way of introductions, but we're really excited to talk about the FloodSense project. It was first seeded by us, C2 Smart Center, and the US DOT funding in 2020 to develop a publicly accessible platform that provides real-time flood information through these small deployed sensors are capable of detecting the presence of water. It's grown into a really cool, really impactful project, and I'm excited to speak to the members you see right now. I actually want to let each of you maybe introduce yourself. So would you mind just quickly saying who you are, your background, and what your role is on the team? Maybe starting with Andrea, Charlie, Elizabeth, Praneeth.
Well, hi everyone, I'm Andrea Silverman. I'm an assistant professor at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. I'm an environmental engineer by training, and I've sort of more recently been going into the urban flooding world as well. And I'm one of the, I co-lead the project with Elizabeth and Charlie and a couple others.
I'm Charlie Midlarts. I'm a research assistant professor at CUSP, and I was lucky enough to join the project 2 years ago. And by training, I'm an acoustician, which is a weird career trajectory, but I kind of moved into IoT and urban sensing through my research at CUSP. And then I've worked on noise monitoring projects, and then the latest and exciting project is FloodNet, and just happy to be here.
My name is Elizabeth Hinoff. I'm assistant professor also at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. My background is in computational biology, which is also a weird career trajectory to end up here. But I guess the conductive thread is that I've always been interested in how environments become data, and so this project kind of fits into that general interest.
Hey, my name is Praneeth. I'm a recent graduate from Tandon with master's in computer engineering. I joined FloodNet since around 2020, and since then I've been working with Andrea, Charlie, and Elizabeth, and I'm a sensor engineer on the team right now, and everything sensor related stuff. And if there's any bottom stuff, I just leave it to the PIs. So.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
Praneeth's been really instrumental in the design of the FloodNet sensors.
Awesome. So first of all, thanks everyone for being here. Really excited to talk with you. I think I'll just toss this first one at Charlie, since he's explained this to me like a couple of times now. But Charlie, can you share with everyone what is FloodSense and what is the FloodNet consortium?
Well, I mean, it began as FloodSense, which is the original funded project that we worked on with C2 Smart. And in the impetus there, I'll just briefly give the start of the project. Is that okay, Andrea and Elizabeth? So the background here is that Elizabeth and Andrea were looking to swab sidewalks, and please jump in if I'm going to butcher this, but swab sidewalks to understand the microbiome after flood events. And there was a need to know when flooding had happened, because there was no system out there that could tell you when a flood had happened in New York City. So I was introduced to Andrea and Elizabeth to help them develop a sensor network to just basically tell us when a flood had happened. And really that was the first interest there. But then the more we thought about the data that a flood sensor could generate, we realized that knowing how, when a flood had happened is really interesting and really helpful, but knowing the details of that flood, so how the profile of that flood develops, how does it onset and how does it then dissipate out as the water drains away, is incredibly useful and really helpful to various agencies within the city. So DOT obviously are really interested in that for mobility issues. DEP, who managing the stormwater systems underneath the city. So there was huge interest in that. And so we were FloodSense back then, building this prototype sensor network. And as we realized that there was interest from city agencies on this, we were introduced to a group at CUNY who were doing a very, very similar thing with exactly the same technology, which is fantastic. That kind of validated our sensor approach. And then we started working with the Mayor's Office of the CTO and the Mayor's Office of Climate and Resiliency, which has changed name already. I don't know what it is recently, but so then that group, that consortium, we named FloodNet. So we had FloodSense on the NYU side, and then the larger consortium was FloodNet. And yeah, that's the kind of the brief story.
Can I add in also, so as Charlie mentioned, Elizabeth and I and Tiga Brain had a seed grant from the Marin Institute at NYU for this, trying to understand the impacts to the environment of floodwater, because there's often sewage in floodwater. Floodwater tends to be super, super contaminated. And so as researchers, we never knew when to sample. Just because it rains doesn't mean it floods. Sometimes it floods when you don't think it's going to flood. So that's why we sort of decided we needed a sensor to tell us when to go down and collect samples. So we sort of became this researcher stakeholder and had researcher needs for a flood sensor. As Charlie mentioned, we were introduced to our colleagues at the City University of New York. And their impetus for starting this project was actually more about community science. And so they were working with communities down around Jamaica Bay for a project called Flood Watch, which is a really awesome project where they, communities down around Jamaica Bay, it floods every month almost when there's a higher than usual high tide. And community members there were sharing photos on Facebook and with each other and their neighbors. And the Flood Watch project, they tried to, when they're still doing is compiling those stories, so photos and stories and experiences around flooding. And they were kind of approached by the city because they were partnering with some city agencies where the city said, well, this is great, this is awesome, but we would really like to have quantitative data to validate this. And so they actually came to this project from a more community engaged side. So like, what do community members need from flood sensor data? And then the glue was the city. And so the city had their own needs. And the city brought us together with CUNY, and it's the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice now, what Charlie was mentioning. And so we've kind of congealed to this consortium and have those three user needs that kind of came together in an organic way.
One of the things that's really interesting about this team, and you've gotten at it a couple of times, is how interdisciplinary it is. And I'm curious, if you can shortly explain how you found each other. Like is Charlie a name in sensors? Like, how did you tap each other to work on this project?
Well, I can maybe speak to that one. I mean, we knew of Charlie's project with the Sonic project, the Sounds of New York project. So actually all three of us are part of the Center for Urban Science and Progress, which is kind of a multi-departmental center here at NYU Tandon. So we had heard of Charlie as being, the sensor engineer who had been working on the Sounds of New York City project, and we were actually introduced by the director of CUSP, Juan Bello, who was like, "Oh, you guys want sensors? I've got a sensor person for you."
I'm so glad that intro was made, because it's a really exciting project, and like Sonic's been really fun to work on, and it's trying to help solve a big issue in the city, but FloodSense, it's a much more tangible issue, and it's very impactful, and it's something that's really good to work on. It's a good thing.
I think it must be very cool also to be known as a sensor guy.
I'm honored. Yeah, no, I'm really glad to be known as that. When I first started at CUSP, I said I don't want to be known as a sensor guy, because back then I was an acoustician, I was a soundscape guy, and then I'm glad now to be known as that.
I'm not a sensor guy. I'm a soundscape guy.
Yeah.
So I was curious, are there similar flood detection sensors available commercially? And I mean, you mentioned that CUNY was doing similar work. So what is it about this project or its team or the timing of this work that's really taken off?
Well, I mean, there are commercial solutions to monitor flooding. Like, I guess from the spectrum of those solutions, you've got the kind of government developed and deployed systems like the USGS deploys these systems. These are quite expensive. They're about 16,000, these satellite connected flood monitoring stations. And they have limited numbers of those deployed around the city. And they're the kind of gold standard of data, but they're very expensive to maintain and they're sparse in space around the city. And then you've also got commercial solutions, which are pretty expensive still and not particularly accurate. And, you know, they maybe not have the connectivity that we needed, because we needed to put these things in any location where there may be flooding. And there's no guarantee that you're going to have any kind of infrastructure to power or provide connectivity for these things. So we felt like there wasn't a system out there that was able to tick the boxes that we needed ticked. So that's why we went about and developed this flood system, which uses very similar technology. It uses like an ultrasonic sensor, keeping with my acoustic background, and you know, a very low power system. So we're not reliant on power or networking infrastructure as we have been with other projects like Sonic, which is Wi-Fi or cellular connected, which is high power, expensive, and does rely on power being there, which you can't guarantee for flood monitoring.
There's a question from someone in the audience, but I just want to quickly ask Praneeth if you could talk a little bit about the development, the engineering and development process of the sensor. Like what maybe some things you're especially excited about your design.
Yeah, definitely. Like the quality of data and like capturing floods. I think that's where we started. We put down a prototype, and the initial days was just like trying to discover which technology was working the best. And then we, like Charlie mentioned, we chose ultrasonic, and there was lots of testing in buckets, pipes, tubes, and all sorts of things. And we realized trying to be away from all the dirt and water is the best. So that led us to this design on the pole, which is on the top. And yeah, that almost the first year was almost trying to figure out how to get good quality, good data, like, you know, of like good quality, which is reliable, and also which is actually it's on the water that it's seeing. And the ultrasonic measurements are really dependent on the temperature, so that gave us a lot of noise. And we applied some filters and did a lot of experiments around it to get better data in general. And then this is our final prototype from the pictures. Yeah, very sleek.
I feel like Praneeth is underselling his mammoth efforts during, because we this project started in, was it like March?
February, I think February 2020.
February 2020.
Yeah.
And something happened around then.
Yeah.
So then we had to basically shift labs back to people's apartments, and Praneeth built a flood simulator in his bedroom, powered by pumps. So I just imagine all night this thing pumping water back and forth between buckets to try and test whether a particular sensor type was able to measure flooding in the accuracy that we needed and in a reliable nature. So huge effort from Praneeth during a lockdown, and you know, it was incredible.
It was like a worst roommate story.
FloodSim 3000.
FloodSim 3000. Yeah.
So question from someone in the audience. I love that so much of this project came from community engagement and grassroots understanding of neighborhood needs. How has that relationship evolved since you're obviously managing overlapping groups of stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, what's been nice is that the projects are sort of merging into each other in some ways. So Flood Watch is still its own project. You know, our goals are slightly different. You know, we're collecting quantitative data and they're collecting qualitative data, but we're working right now. We just got a grant from the Sloan Foundation that's gonna do kind of thinking a lot more about public engagement. So what are our goals when it comes to public engagement? What are our strategies for doing that? And one of the things that we're going to be doing as part of that work is also trying to figure out how to best mesh Flood Watch, which is its qualitative reports, with FloodNet, which is the quantitative. One thing that's nice also is with the sort of merging of all these groups, we have different communities that we're already connected to. And so we're able to kind of learn about different community groups. I should also note is that every time we go into a new neighborhood, we do outreach to either community-based organizations or local environmental organizations that are in that neighborhood, because everyone, people living in the neighborhood know where flooding happens more than we do. So we have a couple places we can look for ideas where we might see flooding, but we always ask for recommendations of places to put sensors, and we make sure we have some community buy-in. And so it's been nice to have our group merge with the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay and the CUNY team, because we've been able to kind of share those learnings and contacts. Thanks.
Maybe another thing to add is that it's also quite a kind of collaborative relationship with these community organizations, because we have needs also with respect to setting up infrastructure for communication, that we need local collaborators. So being able to set up the LoRa communication stations that do require power and connectivity. So yeah, we definitely, that's kind of like a very active collaborative relationship that we have with these community organizations.
So we went into, I guess a recent example is Red Hook. So we're working with Pioneer Works in Red Hook, and they've been fantastic. They'd allowed us to mount our gateway on the rooftop of Pioneer Works, and the antenna is up on a smokestack. So we have amazing network coverage of Red Hook. And we're also trying to work our way into NYCHA so that we can mount gateways on top of NYCHA buildings. And because typically most areas have some NYCHA housing where we can, and they're generally quite tall, so we can mount our gateways up there to provide coverage. And it's quite an involved process getting permissions for that kind of work, but it's very important, and it allows us then to work with these community groups. And also through the deployments of these gateways, we provide connectivity to any sensors. It's like a public network that we're building. So anyone with a LoRaWAN sensor can use that gateway to push traffic through. So in Red Hook, the community garden down there now has coverage for LoRaWAN, so they could use any kind of like ag tech that uses LoRaWAN to push data through our gateway.
I just want to note that's in addition to Pioneer Works Community Center Lab, it's also the Red Hook Initiative and Resilient Red Hook, who have been really, really helpful in different kind of segments of the community.
So this has like become quite a large project with many stakeholders, and I think what I'm struck by is kind of like the project management aspects, like the team dynamic aspects. Do you have any guidance for researchers or teams of researchers who are, maybe very good at collaborating, but like when things start to break, when you have this massive implementation problem, what would you say to teams of researchers looking to do similar projects?
I would say hire Praneeth if you can. Always there, always responsive. I think from an IoT like sensing perspective, I don't know, just generally you just need staff on hand, like to manage and maintain this kind of deployment, because you have to manage gateways and sensors, and there's always bugs to fix, changes to make, developments to make. So you've got a process, you're kind of in operational mode, and then you switch to research mode to develop new features and improve the system. But you constantly got to remember that you've put loads of stuff around the city that will need upkeep. So there's like just from the tech standpoint, yeah, you're maintaining and developing throughout. So you're kind of switching modes quite often.
I would also
think
clear roles and responsibilities, building on everyone's strengths. So, we are a really interdisciplinary team, and we're a big team, but it is a big project. And so making sure that each pillar of the project is owned by somebody, and having a project manager to really be on top of everyone to make sure nothing slips through the cracks or gets lost between those pillars. That's from the project management side. We have other things to say about working with the city, but I think there's probably another question related to that.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that too. I mean, yeah, I guess like if I could push you even further on this, what is it about your team in particular that that's different from maybe some other research teams that you've encountered in terms of staying organized, staying collaborative on these very large projects?
Well, one thing that has been really important, and then I really do want to stress is that we have members of the team who work for New York City, right? I think that's really, really important in terms of having a more translational applied project that actually is trying to get something out across the city. It's really helpful because first of all is that we have this sort of bi-directional conversation all the time about priorities and needs. And so there's priorities and needs from the side of the city. We have priorities and needs, and we're able to actually discuss them on a weekly basis. And there's a lot of things that you need when you're deploying something in the city. So one, we could design a sensor and we can publish it and we can put it on GitHub and we can tell people about it, but you don't get super far in terms of actually getting a huge network out in the city unless you have buy-in from the city, because we've needed so much help for getting permission for deployment. So we put our sensors up on street signposts, and we've had just a tremendous help from our city colleagues in helping negotiate with, for example, the DOT to understand what infrastructure is okay for us to use, how we can let them know, how we can ask permission, and having that conversation. So we're not telling anyone anything, we're really talking about it as partners. As Charlie mentioned, one of the big challenges also with setting up a big sensor network is having these gateways. So we really did design the sensors so they can be as independent as possible. So they don't have a huge energy draw. We can just put them up out on the street and they don't need connectivity, but they all have to talk to a centralized piece of equipment called a gateway. And that gateway does have to be plugged in and does need to be connected to the internet. And that sometimes is a challenge. And as Elizabeth mentioned, having community partnerships helps us also find locations, but we're trying to figure out, okay, systematically as we expand across the city, what's infrastructure that would be easier for us to access? So we're having conversations to see if there's city infrastructure. City owns a lot of buildings. And so that conversation, what's really nice is like our colleagues from the city are having conversations with other people who work for the city, and we're there when we need to be, but they know who to talk to and how to talk to them, right? They know what needs to be discussed. And I think that also is really an incredible asset. And one thing I will say is, like, for other projects, like who might be thinking about, being interested in working with the city or implementing something on the city scale, it takes a lot of time in terms of building relationships. And also we meet with our colleagues multiple times a week, right? But it's worth it, totally worth it. And it's worth putting in that effort.
If I'm understanding the history of this project correctly from your earlier comments and from previous conversations, you have, it's come organically out of an identified data gap, and then you put together a team, and it seems like more than a happy coincidence, but when you fill a data gap in an exciting area, it was natural that the city took interest in this project. And when we think about funding research projects, I kind of think from two different perspectives. One is this organic need. So a researcher is really interested in a topic, and then it gets funded and it may or may not take off. Or from the other way, in which a potential end user gives an idea for the kinds of projects that they want to fund. Do you have any thoughts, any of you, or like kind of a preference? If we're trying to see more implementable, impactful research projects, if there's a particular way, maybe like funding organizations or researchers or stakeholders doing research should approach their research? That was a big long question. Basically, like from which direction should the research needs come from, ideally, to make impactful research?
I think they should come from the city. I know that's something, I mean, it's both. It really is. So I have thinking about the projects that I'm working on with the city. So I have this project and one more. It takes lots of relationship building and learning for a while before this comes to be, right? So I think for the FloodNet project, it was pretty incredible that, like, we submitted a proposal to C2 Smart with this idea of, like, this is a gap. And like a month after we submitted that proposal, we got one of our colleagues at the city had emailed Juan Bayo and said, is anyone working on flood detection or flood sensing? Like, totally out of the blue, best timing we could have ever imagined, like really fortuitous. I think one thing to note is that it helps for when you're building these relationships over time, then when there's a city need or a municipality need, they know who to ask. And so that's what happened, right? Like there was a sensing need for flood detection. Our colleagues at the city knew to reach out to Juan because Juan had done a lot of sensing work in the urban environment, right? And then Juan was like, oh, actually, it turns out, this team is working on this. So I think that that's one way is like, people, if you have an ongoing conversation with people who work for a municipality, then they start to know, okay, well, when we have a need, we know who to ask. I think the other thing that becomes that is helpful is when you are part of conversations for a while, then you start to better understand needs and priorities. And that's where it can kind of come more from a researcher side, but understanding sort of what the outlying gaps are based on those conversations. And so it is definitely, again, for those who want to do more translational and applied work, it is totally worth like going to meetings, just to go to meetings and meet people, just to hear what others have to say with no agenda. It's an agenda, but it's not a specific agenda, like really trying to understand what the needs are. So a lot of listening and a lot of conversation.
We also had I think a good way to, if you're looking to like integrate and like get into the city agency groups that might be interested in tackling different problems, is the Town and Gown program is pretty good for that, right? So it's a group run by the DDC, and they bring together a bunch of the people that you want to meet within different agencies, the people that want to try and tackle these problems, that will be more engaged with academic groups doing research. And that's a great way to, for example, to get letters of support for funding, or just to like have an engaged group within an agency. Because really, you don't want to be pushing, because agencies, you can't push them to do anything that isn't on their remit. You're just going to get nothing. But that's what was great with FloodNet. As Andreas said, it's just, they really wanted, this is something that on their radar, they wanted to try and fix it. So they were just providing things to us, which is the way you want it to be. And we just we're developing the tech with them as opposed to just trying to push tech on them.
I definitely have a lot more questions about kind of like the research engine that we're trying to like propagate here. We're about the halfway mark, so I just want to reiterate if audience members are tired of my question or voice, I definitely encourage you to ask some of your own. Otherwise, definitely a lot more questions about the aspects of this project. What we haven't really spoken about quite yet, I think, can you tell us what happened with the big storms in the recent year, I guess it is now. Like what role did FloodNet play in those storms?
Well, it was really exciting. I mean, there were terrible storms. Right? There were terrible events for New York City, and we had sensors in a couple of locations that picked up the severity and illustrated graphically how dangerous those storms were and the impact they had in terms of flooding. So Henri and Ida, so these were back in August 2021. We had sensors around the Gowanus area. We were still in our pilot phase, and we detected just incredibly fast flood situations, like flash flood situations, where the water was coming up over a period of 15, 20 minutes, was coming up to around 3 feet deep. That's some fast flowing water, and there were many emergency calls with people stuck in vehicles at those locations. What was really, what was kind of a plus for the FloodNet network is that we were already hooked in a number of agencies into our alerting system. So we built this alerting system that would send out emails with plots and data and warnings when flooding hit a certain level. So over I think it was like 6 inches for some period of time, we would email blast the emergency management email addresses and a number of key people within the National Weather Service, DEP. So what was great for FloodNet was that those alerts were hitting their emails about an hour before they knew there was flooding at that location. So that was the first kind of indication that FloodNet was providing a really useful service to those key agencies that are tasked with responding to these events. And what we did after that was we kind of went on a bit of a shameless sales pitch, and we packaged up plots and we overlaid rainfall and the flood data that we collected from the sensors, and we sent it out to more people who were involved in managing flooding in the city, and it really did help get us on the radar of many more people and kind of pique the interest of the city more than it already had. But it was incredible. Yeah, that data was really interesting and useful, and we get that from every flood. So there's going to be more of that, and in a hope that it can be used to do things like divert traffic, when maybe the DOT might want to do that to try and stop people from driving into these flooded areas. The DEP can look at that data and see if there's some kind of blockage in these storm drains, or work out ways that they may need to upgrade infrastructure to improve the kind of removal of that flood water. And yeah, those events were terrible, but kind of good for our system because it proved it out in that scenario.
I was wondering what comes next for the FloodSense project, FloodNet project, and why you're excited about it.
I guess the next step is we're expanding. Based on these pilots, the city showed more and more interest, and we're working with them to secure more funding and to deploy up to 500. You have to say up to, but we're going to do up to 500 sensors. That could be 50 gateways deployed, up to 500 sensors. And we actually just got some more funding from C2 Smart, looking at ways that we can optimize and choose deployment locations based on kind of more equitable metrics for the city. I mean, we're hoovering up a bunch of data on mobility, equity, loads of variables that help us really place sensors in the locations where they're needed. Obviously where it's flood prone, but factoring in all these other metrics. And that's pretty key. We want this to be a network which is in places where it's needed for the city.
Yeah, if I could ask you to elaborate further. So in terms of equity, I'm kind of imagining it, it's communities that maybe are not, their voices are not as amplified as other communities, but they still have the same flooding issues. And so you want to avoid situations in which the infrastructure upgrades and decision making is prioritized just by volume as opposed to actual needs. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're still, in terms of the equity metrics, one of our, the goals of this work is to think about what those metrics should be. And there's different, one thing that we're definitely taking into account is social vulnerability, so thinking about how challenging is it for certain communities to rebound after a major event or a major disaster. Environmental justice areas. We're definitely taking into account flood hazards, so where is flooding predicted to occur. But there's also a need for equity across space and spatial, so making sure we have equitable deployment in different boroughs to make sure you're not forgetting, for example, one section of the city or another just because it happens to be closer or more vocal. Some neighborhoods have more vocal community groups, for example, than others. So making sure that we don't sort of skew based on those voices.
And so what's different now?
Maybe
Sorry,
just
ahead, please.
the next step that we're super excited about is, so we got some funding from the Sloan Foundation to prototype methodologies for public engagement. And so there's kind of an equity factor in that also, in the sense that, as engineers, we get super excited about data and looking at plots on a computer screen, but acknowledging that for a lot of folks, that's not exactly a legible medium. So thinking about ways to explore different types of relationships with the data, but also relationships with living with water and living with, in the context of increased frequency of flooding events in general. And so as such, we're putting together kind of a multidisciplinary team, including practitioners from the humanities and design fields, to try to think about, from a broad kind of from a broad perspective, what are the principles and pathways that as a team should be guiding these research efforts? And so we're prototyping digital interactive data visualization dashboards, but also static reports, because one of the things that kept coming up in community meetings was that people would be like, I just want something that I can print out and take to my community board meeting. Like, I don't need to see like a super fancy dynamic thing. So thinking about those different modalities of communication, and also thinking about kind of more broadly, how do we engage with these topics? And so we're really excited to run an artist residency program over this summer and over the continuing year to kind of commission work from multidisciplinary artists, some who work with data, some who work with performance, to engage with these topics.
Very cool.
And one other,
And so,
sorry, I know we keep cutting you off. The data
Oh, sorry.
dashboard. So there's also a question in the Q&A. So we are developing a data dashboard that can provide the flood data in real time. And by real time, we take measurements every minute. And so there might be like a 3 to 5 minute delay. We're still figuring that out, but essentially real time delivery of flood data from the sensors to a publicly available online dashboard. It's currently in its beta phase, but it should be like our fully functional dashboard should be up this summer. And we're really looking forward to that. And we've been working in consultation with some of our community partners on that and to the agency partners to understand what is the most useful way to present this data. Does the data make sense in the way it's presented? And I think that this is also sort of ongoing research, as Elizabeth mentioned, like we'll be iterating over time. But we're excited about being able to provide this data to all of you and our community partners very soon.
but yeah, I almost missed. There's actually quite a few questions in the Q&A that I'd like to.
And we've been slowly answering some of them, and it looks like they go to the answered section. If you are looking for the answer to some of your questions, we can also talk about them.
Yeah, feel free. If we miss the questions, feel free to just ask them again. We'll get to them. We have some time. So just, I guess, working backwards here, can you talk more about, well, we talked a little bit about this new CT Smart Center project involving the placement of the sensors, but I guess if you had a rough idea as of now, or your intuitions about where these sensors will place, like how far apart are they? How dense are the sensors placed? And maybe how do you address issues with sensor failure and maybe accuracy issues about the sensors?
Well, we're placing them. I mean, we want to cover as many neighborhoods as possible that are flood prone. So we want citywide coverage of flood prone areas, but at the macro scale, but at the micro scale down on the street, because we're trying to understand how flooding develops and how it actually happens on the ground, we may have a couple of sensors or a few sensors maybe across the street. In fact, in Gowanus, where Hurricane Henri and Ida had their biggest impacts, we do have sensors across the street. Because the thing with our sensors is that we're typically on signposts, and they are normally on the sidewalk. So, we're not actually measuring the flood depth at the deepest point on the roadway or on the sidewalk. So we want to be in a number of locations as we're understanding kind of flood extent and how the flood moves and consumes like a roadway. We're working on ways that we can infer the flood depth at the deepest point on a roadway by using topographical maps and what's that data called? The elevation.
So the LiDAR data?
The LiDAR data, yeah. And there was that data set that's like the elevation data for the city as well.
The digital elevation maps.
Yeah, so that we can then, based on when we start detecting a flood on a sidewalk, we can know how relatively high that sidewalk position is that we're measuring the flood at, and then infer the deepest depth of the flood. So that's ongoing research that we're working on. Hang on, there was more to that question, right?
I'll add to that. I think that, the interesting thing about this data set that differs from other sort of IoT environmental data. So I think like when you think about low cost sensors and sensor networks, established projects include like air quality monitoring, for example, or temperature monitoring, rainfall monitoring. And one thing with all of those data sets is you have point source, like point sources where you're collecting that data and you can interpolate, because you actually have like a sort of linear or some sort of relationship from point A to point B. It may not be linear, but there's a relationship. With flooding, because of sort of the complex topography of the city and all these, what I'm calling like micro watersheds, we can't do that. And so when we're going to have, let's say, 500 points where you have flood data, an open research question is, what do you do about all the points where there is not flood data, right? And so that is open for sure. And we're very aware of the challenges that exist when you're making decisions off of data, when that data does not exist everywhere. And so we're trying to be as open as possible to say, all right, well, we know that this corner floods because we have flood data. That corner, we don't have flood data, but it doesn't mean flooding is not happening there. And so just really being, it's important. So I think that that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and there's definitely open questions there, because I can't remember who asked this question, but yes, 500 sensors does not cover every flood prone section of the city. So we're going to be methodical as possible in placing them, but also try to figure out how to relate non-sensed locations to those that are sensed.
And we're very aware that 500 of anything in the streets is difficult to maintain. So we're building out tools, monitoring tools that alert us as engineers when a sensor fails. And we can watch for things like trending battery level. If that's trending down and we know there's been weather, we can automatically kind of alert the team to say the solar panel might be out, or probably more likely a tree has bloomed and like there's no light hitting the panels, so we need to move that sensor or adjust it or do something, right? So we've implemented this on past projects, and we're going to do the same thing here, but at a bit more advanced. So just having a full automated system that will just tell the engineering team what the fault might be and where the fault is, and then how to fix that fault. So you're kind of trying to reduce the complexity of future maintenance down the road, because this system is ultimately expected to be handed off to the city at some point in the future, maybe after 5 or so years. So it's got to be very easy to manage and run, and having a system to tell you what the fault might be, when and where to fix it, is going to be really helpful. And that also comes down to accuracy as well. Just to follow on with the question, what filters have helped with accuracy? And that's a great question, because it's an ultrasonic sensor that just bounces sound waves off the ground. So a person standing beneath the sensor can show a very intense flood happening, right? Like a 6-foot thing just appears. And we actually had that issue when was it the Brooklyn Marathon? The New York Marathon. So loads of people were stood by the road watching the marathon runners go past, and we saw biblical floods hitting our whole system, 6-foot floods just immediately appearing and just sustaining for hours. But we're working on algorithms that are able to ignore and remove those kinds of events. So like imagine a car driving beneath one of our sensors. It's not likely, because typically a car won't be that close, but if that happens, we can detect that gradient of jump in depth of floods, or in depth, and we can ignore those as erroneous. Same with trash or bikes being locked beneath a sensor, because these posts are used for that. We're developing more simple algorithms, but we're also developing machine learning based algorithms that can just ignore and remove out those erroneous peaks. So we're just left with floods.
I have a question that I've been wanting to ask you all, which is, I'm thinking about all of our stakeholders at the university, but especially CT Smart Center. There's students, there's researchers, there's us in the administration of the CT Smart Center. How do we go about, if we wanted to have more FloodSense projects, FloodNet, how do we find, fund, produce, implement more projects from each of the perspectives of stakeholders? I'd love to hear each of you weigh in on this.
I would say, I think having the CT Smart seed funding, this project wouldn't have happened if we didn't have that, for sure. So having these pots of money, whatever size, to help. And I should say also the Marin Institute funding, like there's certain seed funds that like helped us develop project from something that was like not fully formed into this bigger thing. So I think that that's one thing that you guys should definitely keep doing. But maybe, you know, more opportunities for open conversation with the stakeholders you're intending to serve, right? Because again, it's like there needs to be these shared priorities for this type of project to be able to expand.
Yeah, there are different ways that might help with that. Like something we're trying to develop with the mayor's office of the CTO is test beds for this kind of research. So specifically on the IoT like sensing side, it's very difficult to get permission to mount on things in the city. And something we're trying to develop is maybe it'll be downtown Brooklyn is a test bed for smart cities research with whatever university wants to get involved and whatever agency wants to get involved. Because there are groups within agencies that really do want to push smart cities work and kind of promote that through the city because they have problems that they want to try and solve. And, you know, us joining together and helping develop this kind of program so that enables us to use a test bed. Because if you can test something out, like agencies are they want to see something working first before they'll really commit to it because they're resource constrained and they have to make sure it's going to be a feasible project. So test beds allow us to pilot, prove that something works out, and then you can go for larger collaborations and rollouts of these kind of technologies. So yeah, if we could all get involved in pushing that, and I think as NYU and as any interested stakeholder, that'd be great.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just wanted to like really highlight what Andrea said about how the fact that the seed money that we got from the Mount Marin Foundation really allowed us to kick off this project. And it was a, you know, modest amount of money, but I think having small pots of money kind of available within institutions with really low barriers to entry is really helpful to be able to just like kick off a prototype for a project and get a few students involved. So I think in particular that like maybe low risk, potentially low reward model for funders, I think is really helpful for research teams because it is a huge amount of labor to put together like really comprehensive research proposals. And so sometimes that can, I think, be, you know, can be a reason why ideas maybe don't like, maybe why like just ideas that are starting off don't necessarily get acted on. So yeah.
And that funding also was really flexible, and we appreciate that. Like, very grateful. Flexible in time, and also in sort of there was an interesting tangent to go on, which was this, and they allowed us to go on that tangent, and we're really hands off, and they were like, we're just psyched with what you're doing, keep at it. So flexibility, yeah. Right, in time and also content.
Yep.
And Praneeth, what about you? Like for maybe student researchers or recent graduates or postdocs, do you have any guidance? Like how do people get more involved in these really exciting projects?
I guess you just have to find your people, you know, find cool mentors or people you think are cool, like Andrea, Charlie, or Elizabeth or Siga. Yeah, like I would say, like just try and find opportunities which really intrigues you, you know, or you can find this bizarre problem that they want to solve, like, you know, put up flood sensors to swap. So that got me hooked. It's very bizarre and interesting. I know nothing about microbiome or flooding, but yeah, like I would say definitely where your interest lies in really matters.
Yeah, and I think one thing that stood out when we were looking for research assistants was the fact that you had done some volunteer work in the Gowanus already, you know? And so I think as far as research goes, I think motivation is probably the key ingredient, maybe even more so than like technical experience or past experience and stuff. I mean, that's important too. I'm not saying that it's not, but yeah, so I think, you know, topics that you think are interesting is the
cool
way.
Experience. We don't need that. I was also wondering
Our
if
job
Andrea,
is to learn, right? So
definitely. Andrea, you mentioned something interesting, I think, which is maybe you could talk more about like this. I perceive sometimes that there might be a tension between, especially in terms of funding, flexibility of funding versus trying to direct funding towards a very particular set of outcomes. For example, directly meeting stakeholder needs. And so is this a real tension? Am I imagining this? Like how should research funders think about navigating tension to avoid like quelling innovation versus like, some people just need structure which to work towards an impact.
Oof, I don't know. I mean, I think that I think there's probably space for both, to be honest. Like, there's space for both, but they're getting big interdisciplinary projects off the ground does require some flexibility and again, there's been multiple points in time with this project where we've been like, okay, how are we going to fund this random thing? How are we going to fund this random thing that we absolutely need? Or like, how are we going to fund this other person? We need the skill set. How are we going to find the funds to pay them for a couple months? And I think having a little bit of flexibility also in funding has helped us be able to fill those needs. And so having that sort of concrete, this is what we're doing funding, but also like another set, because you just don't know what you're going to need sometimes. And I think that some funding can be a bit, in terms of having to stay with your certain line items, right? You budget out, you have like these line items, and that's what your funds are going towards. But every once in a while, we're like, oh man, we really need like a little bit of funding for this thing that we totally didn't budget for. But it's like, out of the blue, it's been nice to have some kind of discretionary funds to be able to work with. So I don't know. I mean, it's tricky. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left. So it's last call for questions to share with panelists here. I was also wondering if I could hear your thoughts on so other interesting cities who have flooding or resilience problems of their own. What guidance do you have to agencies who are looking to adopt this technology or similar technology and scale it in their states or cities?
Oh, we get a lot of interest, to be honest, which is awesome, really exciting. But in terms of things we'd love to do in the future and have funding for, it's not just a sensor, right? That you can't just buy a sensor and have it give you the information that you need. There's a lot of work that like Praneeth and Charlie and the rest of the team are doing to like set up the network and the back end and the software and the data visualization tools. And I think that sometimes you can be like, oh, we just get a sensor and we'll get the data. It's like, no, there's so much more. And I think that one thing that I hope we can find funding for do in the future also is to help develop these tools for other municipalities to use as well. We do have everything open source. I don't know if we've said that yet in this symposium, or what do you call this?
Panel?
This panel, thank you. Everything's open source. So everything that we've developed, you can go to our GitHub site and like get the plans, get the build files, etc. But we do understand that just because that information's out there doesn't mean that you can just immediately be able to build. But I would say, yeah, partnerships, these sort of like interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder collaborative groups, I definitely would recommend it, but understanding like it takes time. And so that's another thing, like for researchers, I think that there's another thing where sometimes the academic priorities don't necessarily aren't totally in line with this type of project. And I think that some of us have just been like, well, this is important to us, so we're going to do it anyway. And I think that that's another thing where there has to be an understanding that this type of project takes a lot of time and may have different types of outputs.
We try to develop it so that it's as New York City agnostic as possible, if that makes sense. So it can be just moved to another location, and with the right people from a different city, IT folk and engineers to like deal with the back ends, like the server stuff, and the engineers to work with the sensors. You could totally roll it out in any city. It doesn't need to be New York. It's not reliant on being in New York, but you still need the those cheerleaders within the agencies, the people that are going to take the technology and want to engage with it. And for example, like getting you permission to mount on the signposts. You know, if we were lucky because we had city people on our side that would definitely helped kind of streamline that process of getting those permissions, but you would need that in a different city. Otherwise, you're going to be just there with a bunch of sensors and a server set up, but nowhere to put them. So it's like, you definitely need, there's a bunch of things you need. And I think that makes me think that we should document this process of like, if you wanted to just take it to Boston or somewhere, what are the things you need? Not just servers and sensors, but what people and what motivations do they need to have to work with you to make it happen? Like, it's all these parts need to be in place.
I'd be really interested in seeing that kind of project happen, maybe next year.
Yeah, I'm gonna regret saying that. You know, towards the end of this.
I want to thank everyone, Andrea, Elizabeth, Praneeth, Charlie, our audience today. I want to acknowledge that the seed funding we're talking about comes from US DOT, which funds the C2 Smart Center. And in the chat, I shared some ways to get involved with C2 Smart. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for all the questions. They were really great. And if we didn't answer some of them, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, so I gave the general alias C2Smart at nyu.edu, but if you have any questions for our presenters, I'm sure they'd be happy to field your questions.
For sure.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.